Hey, I'm Sam with Billito Services. I'm a filmmaker, colorist, and expert in video technologies, including high dynamic range imaging. One thing that I've done a lot of over the years is test new technologies, including testing new cameras and devices for how to use them in a production environment and how to get the best image out of them. So when Apple announced the new iPhone 13 with, again, an upgraded camera like they seem to do every year, I had to get one, bring it in, and put it through its paces to see how exactly do we get the best photos, the best SDR video, and the best HDR video out of the iPhone 13 on iOS 15. So I got my iPhone on release day and then tested for about a week and a half before starting to put this video together. It's given me a couple of weekends and a lot of good testing to figure out how the iPhone is shooting in a variety of conditions. I want to start with the conclusions here at the beginning. The camera on the iPhone 13 is great for casual shooting with the ability of becoming or turning it into a professional platform with a little bit of additional work. It's great to have in your pocket. It's very high quality for photos and for videos to just whip out whenever you need it and be able to film or capture what's in front of you. But if you want to use this at a more professional level, it is going to take a little bit more time. You're going to need to invest in some external accessories like neutral density filters or additional lenses, third-party apps, that sort of thing. But you can bring the phone up to a more professional level. It's just built more for the casual user. And we're going to see that when we look at a couple of the elements, how they do skew a little bit more casual. So I've broken this video down into 4 sections. The first is photos with the iPhone 13. Second is SDR video with the iPhone 13, including the new cinematic mode. Third is HDR video with the iPhone 13. And the fourth is using third-party apps to get better photos and videos on the iPhone. Not every part of this video is going to be useful to every user. So I've put a number of topics and chapters that I talk about down in the description below. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know that I have a course on working in high dynamic range video, which you can find at masterhdrvideo.com or watch the first 30 minutes for free here on YouTube. Let's go ahead and get started. First thing I wanted to talk about for photos is Apple ProRAW. ProRAW is Apple's implementation of the DNG digital negative format, a RAW format. It's a 12-bit linear format that allows you to capture more of what the camera actually saw that doesn't get compressed out with JPEG or HEVC. So you're able to do more to the image in post-production, whether that's on the phone, using the Photos app, a third-party app like Snapseed, or using Adobe Photoshop on the computer. A lot of the ProRAW features were enabled on the iPhone 12 Pro. As of iOS 14.3, you were able to enable ProRAW in the camera settings. If you go to your general settings, camera, under formats, toggle on Apple ProRAW. When you toggle that on, it doesn't mean that you're always going to be shooting in DNG. That would be enormous amounts of data to be capturing on a regular basis. So instead, when you do that and you open up the camera app, you're going to get this little RAW icon that initially has a slash through it. But if you want to shoot in DNGs at any point, all you have to do is tap the RAW icon and the camera will switch to capturing in DNG instead of your defaulted JPEG or HEIC. With that update from December 2020 came the ability to airdrop DNGs. Now, this hasn't been very clear to me. How do I get the DNGs off the phone and onto the computer? Primarily because initially I had to use third-party apps to shoot those raw DNGs, and in doing so, they often shot RAW plus JPEG. Well, when Apple sees either a JPEG or an HEIC, or if it sees that you've made any edits to the DNG in the Photos app, it's not going to airdrop that DNG to your computer. Instead, it's going to airdrop the JPEG or the HEIC. So if you want to be capturing on your phone as a pro photographer and get those DNGs off in the simplest way, you're going to want to make sure that if you're using a third-party app, you're only capturing in the RAW, not RAW plus JPEG. And in the Photos app, you don't make any tweaks to your image. If you need to take a tweaked image and send it to the computer in a DNG format, those edits are inside of the Apple software and associated metadata with the DNG, and none of the other platforms are going to read that. So you have to send out that DNG independent of that data, which Apple's recommended solution is to duplicate the image, remove all of your adjustments, and airdrop that new DNG. I've tested that. It works really well to get those DNGs off of the phone onto the computer. And with the new night modes and other forms of shooting, you're going to get a lot of mileage out of the DNG format. A couple of caveats with that is that you can't time lapse into DNG. You also can't shoot panoramas into a DNG format, and you can't shoot portrait mode into DNGs. I think the reason that they don't do this on the panoramas is just because of the amount of data that would be involved in trying to store and capture those large of files into the DNG formats. For the time lapse, the reason they don't use it is because they store it as a video file when you're done. As for portrait mode, you have to remember that portraits are processed by the phone. This isn't something that natively happens in the image. Instead, it's an effect that Apple's applied. In order for you to readjust the portrait at any time, your image data is stored separate from your look data for that portrait mode. That portrait image only shows up in your app. If you're going to send that photo anywhere else, Apple processes it into the JPEG or HEVC for delivery. The best part about shooting with the DNGs is that you can get up to 10 or a little bit more stops of dynamic range with their 12-bit linear. And without the compression that's coming with JPEG or HEVC, you can retain a lot more detail, especially into the darks. Now, one thing that I have noticed with the Apple DNGs is that they don't have very much highlight recovery. So you're going to be better off slightly underexposing with those to make sure that you're retaining as much detail as you can handle on the computer later. The next thing I want to talk about camera-wise are the new default looks that Apple has baked into the camera software in iOS 15. These allow you to choose your shooting style. Most people, they're not going to be taking every photo they take and passing it through the Photos app to tweak the image, change the look, change the color, whatever. Instead, they're just capturing what they have in front of the camera and sending that out to their friends and family or posting to Instagram or Snapchat or wherever your images are going to go. And so with these new default looks, Apple is allowing you, the user, to select how to tweak its default color processing. That's actually going to be a better place to do that than to add looks later if you can find one of their new default looks that you like. That's because that it's going to work on the raw sensor data instead of adjusting the JPEG or HEIC image later. Most people do shoot in a what you see is what you get for the delivery, and this is going to allow you to pick one of these styles that better matches your preferences for how you want to deliver your content. Initially, iOS 15 and the iPhone 13 are going to ask you to pick a default look. If you need to change that, you can head to the camera settings under settings later in order to change that and adjust that. You can also swipe up at any point when you're taking a photo and adjust the look as part of the adjustments that Apple's now giving you for the photos. Along with that is a new introduction for exposure compensation. This allows you, the user, to override how Apple is exposing the scene, at least in part. Now, some of these features have been here since iOS 14.3, but I think they've been a little less known. So I think it's good to talk about them here as we're talking about the new phone and the new camera platform. We all know that we tap on the screen to select a point where Apple is going to reference for focus and exposure. But if you hold and then drag down or up, you're able to adjust that exposure compensation up or down for that shot. If you double tap the box, you lock the exposure and focus so that you can move the camera to a different perspective or angle and capture with those same settings. Now, that's one way of handling exposure compensation. However, if you're not double tapping the box, it constantly resets as you move around the image. Anytime that that it would release that focus when you're shooting, that's what it's going to do. However, you also now have this EV adjustment menu. And I'm going to go talk more about this when I talk about video and when I talk about HDR video, because it has some important implications in those features. But when you're taking still pictures, this works exactly the same way as dragging your thumb up and down, though you have more precision because you're moving in third EV increments. You have plus or minus 2 EV that you can adjust. On the tap and drag, you have more, it's closer to 3 or 4 EV in either direction, but it's slower and you don't exactly know how much you're doing for exposure compensation. Again, what you see on the screen is what you're going to be capturing. What I have noticed is that if you're shooting in brighter outdoor conditions, I almost always want Apple to be shooting at about -1 EV, especially if there aren't very many shadows. Apple's exposure algorithm is going to look at the image and see that, oh, everything's midtones or above, and it's going to hold the midtones in the middle and get a nice big bright image. Well, that doesn't allow for very much richness, and you get pretty flat highlights. So by dropping down the EV by about 1 EV in exposure compensation, you're able to get a much more contrasty, more pleasing image. And that's the same in the photos and in SDR video. I want to note that my tests were done with the standard photographic style. If you're using the higher contrast or the richer contrast photographic style, you're going to want to change that recommendation to only about -0.07 EV. If you're using the vibrant style, you're actually going to want to increase that to about -1.3 EV. And that's just to compensate for the different tone, which is Apple's way of saying contrast plus saturation. New in iOS 15 is an f-stop indicator in portrait mode. This is really useful if you are trying to emulate a certain kind of look with your camera. By opening up this slider, you can adjust the amount of depth of field. That is going to allow you to dial in the exact look that you want in portrait mode. The default f-stop emulation for portrait mode is an f4.5 on the telephoto lens and an f2.8 on the wide lens. If you want to make the background more blurry, you're going to slide that to lower f numbers. If you want to make the background sharper, you're going to slide that to higher f numbers, just like you would with the aperture on a camera lens. Let's talk about macro mode. Macro mode works for both photos and for videos, and it allows you to focus on objects very, very close to the camera. I was super impressed with how well this works. It does auto switch, and it uses the ultra wide camera on these Pro models to take those macro shots. And that's a problem if you're trying to do video because you don't get as much dynamic range, even if you're shooting in HDR on the ultra wide sensor as you do on the wide sensor. I heard rumors that in the 15.1 update, you're actually going to be able to user select when to go into macro mode, because right now it'll just hop in and out if you're close to an object, if it's trying to focus on that. And that's a little bit irritating under the initial release of this. However, the photos are quite good at the end of the day, and I've been really impressed with just how close you can focus. For taking product videos, this is pretty incredible. However, because you are using the ultra wide camera, you do need stabilization. You don't have the OIS, you don't have the sensor shift that you get on the wide camera. So you're not going to get that rock steady, fluid motion that you would if you were being able to shoot those macros on the wide instead of the ultra wide. The biggest feature for the camera in terms of actual look and shooting experience with iOS 15 and the iPhone 13 is night mode. So this is basically a low light shooting mode that by default caps at 1 second. In some conditions will go down to 3, but in iOS 15 and on the new iPhone 13, you can actually extend that to what Apple calls the max mode. When you open up the night mode slider, when the phone has switched into a night mode, you can slide that all the way up to max, and that can give you up to a 30-second exposure in very dark conditions. How Apple is doing this and allowing you to do this freehand is that it's using the image stabilizer inside the cameras, something that's usually used for video, but it basically holds the camera sensor steady as your hands jiggle around it. And that is really, really cool because you're able to get very long handheld exposures like this one. You may get some of these features on the older iPhones as well. However, the lower light capabilities, the sensor dynamic range is slightly extended. So you're going to get cleaner and slightly better images on the iPhone 13 using night mode than you would on previous iPhone models. So when you're shooting in nighttime mode, you're not actually setting the amount of time you want for the exposure. I'm hoping to see that in third-party apps at some point. But with nighttime mode, what Apple's actually doing is they take a series of exposures and do a couple of things with it. One, they try to fine tune the right exposure time versus ISO to keep the noise down. Two, it looks like they're actually pulling a couple of shots together for a little bit of noise reduction. When I go deep into the DNGs and bring up the darks, I'm seeing some artifacts that are very consistent with temporal noise reduction plus sharpening. So I've seen that in other content that I've worked on. So I'm pretty confident that that's how Apple's actually handling a lot of the nighttime mode. So when you bring that into your computer, though, and you look at the XF data, you're actually going to see a much shorter time. We're going to talk about noise in the darks when I talk about HDR video, just because of the additional dynamic range, and we're going to be covering a lot more about exposure there. So stay tuned for that. One thing about night mode is that it hasn't yet shown up in the third-party apps. I'm hoping to see these extended shooting modes in the third-party apps so that I can select the specific amount of time that I want instead of allowing for a little bit of fuzziness with Apple's default timings. When you're actually shooting with this, one of the things I really like is this little cross that appears in the center of your image. This is if you start moving too far away from where you're supposed to be pointing, where the image stabilization isn't going to be able to help as much, Apple's still able to retain data by using your accelerometer and the field of view of the camera to figure out the pixels that it is seeing, how they should be incorporating into that image. However, that little cross peaks up so that you can, just like with panoramas, with the little arrow guides, you can get that recentered back as soon as you can and hold it as close to centered as possible to give the phone the best opportunity for capturing that image. When you're using night mode, if you really want a high quality image, you're going to want to use DNGs if you have that available on the Pro or Pro Max lineup. The reason you want to do that is because the JPEGs and the HEVCs are compressing out too much of the data. A lot of the detail does end up in the darks in this nighttime exposure. And if you add DCT compression to that, which is what's used in JPEG and in HEVC, you're going to remove a lot of that dark detail, and you're not going to be able to bring that out. So by shooting in DNG, you're capturing in linear, you're capturing in RAW, so you're not actually compressing that. You can bring that onto the computer and extract a lot of detail that would otherwise have been lost in the compression. Just seeing how good this was made me want to push it to the next level. I wanted to see exactly how far could this go. So that first image is something I took on iOS 14 on my iPhone 12 Pro at the beginning of September. I was in a dark sky area where I could very clearly see the Milky Way. And I got that image by stacking 7 DNGs on top of each other. I had the phone braced against a picnic table, shooting basically straight up into the sky. I was really pleased with the results. But these new results on iOS 15 and with the new night mode are just absolutely incredible. That is just a gorgeous image. And when we compare it to what I captured on my GH5S with proper camera lens equipment and a proper tripod, that is just phenomenal. The last thing I wanted to say about night mode in taking photos is that on the iPhone 13, Apple is going to be able to use your LiDAR data in order to generate portraits at night. That is really cool because previously it didn't have enough information from the cameras. There's too much noise to actually calculate depth. But now using the LiDAR, it can actually calculate the depth at night, bringing in one less limitation with how you choose to go and use it to shoot. The last thing I wanted to say about photos is that if you want any of your settings to stay consistent as you close the app and move to a different thing, say you set your exposure compensation and you want that to stay the same, Apple has a setting, a group inside of the camera settings that allow you to fix which settings you don't want to change between times opening the app. That can be that you always want it to open up in video mode, you always want it to open up in with a certain exposure compensation. Toggle those toggles inside of that to make sure that the camera is always ready for you when you open it up for the kind of shoot that you're doing. That finishes up what I wanted to talk about for the photos with the iPhone. Now, the next thing that I wanted to look at was SDR video. And the first topic here is the big one that's come to the Pro lineup of the new iPhone 13s, and that is cinematic video. This is portrait mode for video. It has the same sliders, it uses the same techniques for processing, and it uses all of the same tools to generate that blurry, limited depth of field that you got in portrait mode. Now, this is really cool because it really elevates the video shooting on the iPhone to emulate the different lenses to give you a more cinematic look and to be able to use the iPhone and match it to a lot more situations. But cinematic mode on the iPhone has a lot of the same shortcomings as portrait mode does. The biggest one that I found is glasses. It doesn't know what to do with frames in the image or panes of glass in the image. And so it can sometimes blur out the edges in weird ways. It can sometimes blur out objects that are peppered around the foreground in weird ways. Tufts of hair get softened in strange ways because Apple can't fully distinguish between the hair and the background around it. And that is understandable. It means that you're not going to be fully replacing, limited depth of field optics with the iPhone. However, you are going to be able to get really, really good depths of field with this mode to match your cinematic shooting. Two big downsides that I found with it is first that it only captures in 1080p. That's because of the amount of processing power that you actually need to calculate this on the fly and bake it into the image. It's not like portrait mode and stills where it can figure that out later. It has to figure it out in real time. It's just an immensely processor intense task to do that blurring. And so to compensate for that, Apple cuts down the resolution that you can shoot down to 1080p. My other big complaint with it is that the racks happen really fast. One of the touted features of cinematic mode is that if I tap to change focus, it's not just going to pop between one focus or the other, it's going to do a rack. And that's fine, that's great, except that it happens so quickly that sometimes it can be hard to tell that a rack actually happened. Like I mentioned when we were talking about portrait mode, in cinematic video, the default f-stop emulation for the telephoto lens is 4.5, and for the wide-angle lens is 2.8. One of the things that I think is new to iOS 15 is the exposure compensation for videos. This allows you to, again, adjust by a fixed EV for setting your overall exposure. Now, I'm going to talk about EVs a little bit later and how the iPhone actually processes that because it's important to know. But what I did notice is that in my testing, especially when outdoors or when there's a very even set of light, dropping the exposure in video mode gave better results than leaving the exposure where it wanted to be as a default. You can do this by adjusting the scale, or you can do the tap and slide method without the high precision or of knowing exactly how you're compensating in the image. Both work really great, and there's different cases for why you would want to use both in different contexts. So I'm going to leave that up to you to decide what works best for you. With that, I wanted to just share with you how the Apple default camera app adjusts its exposure. You'll see this when you have third-party apps on auto exposure. In bright sunlight situations, it's going to use the shutter speed and shorten that shutter speed in order to reduce the amount of light getting to the sensor while holding the ISO constant, usually at the lowest ISO for the most dynamic range and cleanest image. As you go to middle environments, it starts to interplay between the ISO and the shutter speed, where it kind of tries to seek for a little bit of a balance. On the other hand, once you hit dark conditions, dark indoors, dark outdoors, it switches and the ISO is the dominant exposure method. That's why the noise starts to increase. It's going to hold the shutter speed either constant or variable. If you have that on in the default camera app, it's going to increase that ISO, which increases the noise. And it can get pretty noisy pretty quickly. By about ISO 400, I was starting to see substantial noise in the noise floor. In the default camera app, it's really gross. In the third parties, it's a lot cleaner, but you still have that noise that you have to deal with. That's how the iPhone shoots. The one thing you can do is add the ND in the exterior conditions to prevent it from trying to change that shutter speed. It's also kind of a necessity if you want to shoot outdoors using these third-party apps with a fixed 180 shutter, right? At 24 frames a second, you're at 1/48th of a second, which is very, very bright for direct sunlight. And your ISO, even at 34, is nowhere close to where you'd want it to be. So 3 to 5 stops is usually a good sweet spot. It's not going to introduce too much noise in these third-party apps, and it's going to give you a lot better, cleaner image. As always, the glass you put in front of the camera affects your image, so make sure that you're using good glass with your filters. Okay, let's talk about variable frame rates. Now, the cameras on this phone don't use the fractional frame rates that we're used to for pro film and pro video. So it actually shoots at 24 even, 30 even, 25 even, 50 even, 60 even, instead of the fractionals that you normally would use for video. Now, that's not a problem, but it also shoots in a variable frame rate. Just like other phones, the phones prioritize dropping frames in order to store the frames that they are capturing more than they care about actually having every frame timed exactly the same way. And this is a problem baked into the encoders. So even if you're using third-party apps, you often run into slight variances in the frame rate. Some NLEs don't like that. And if that's the case with the ones that you're using, you will need to reprocess them into a fixed frame rate before you go editing with that. By default, Apple actually has an auto frames per second adjustment that when you do start shooting in the night, it's going to drop down from 30 frames per second down to 24 frames per second. If you don't want that though, there's an option that you can turn off in the camera settings in order to fix it at 30 frames per second or fix it at 60 frames per second. The last iPhone generation and this one both use HEVC encoding or have available HEVC encoding when you go to your formats menu in the camera and turn on high efficiency. That's going to use the H.265 HEVC codec, which is much more efficient and gives you much better quality than H.264. Your file sizes are going to be lower and your quality is going to be higher. The catch is that it's harder to decode on computers. So generally it's okay, but some pieces of software it'll push up your processing time. It'll limit the number of effects you can put on it that'll process in real time. But most modern computers have an HEVC decoder, and all 4K televisions are required to have an HEVC decoder. So using that will still keep compatibility with a lot of devices and minimize your file sizes. When you're shooting slow motion videos in SDR, it can be a little unclear about how to get that video off your phone into your editorial application while preserving all of the frames. If you just airdrop that to yourself or try and send the file out, the phone is actually going to process that video and then using the in and out points that you set, do all of the speed ramps that you captured. Now, if you don't want that, if you want access to the full 240 frames per second or 120 frames per second or whatever it is that you shot in, what you actually need to do when you go to airdrop this is tap on the options menu and toggle the option to transfer all photo data. What that's going to do is it's not going to reprocess the video as you send it to your computer. The file is going to come in and read with a 120 or 240. It's going to read at that speed that you can then interpret in Premiere, in Final Cut, in Resolve, in whatever you're editing with, to get the slow-mo effect that you want without having to bake in or edit that on your phone and without the generational loss that comes with recompressing the image. I want to talk about two more things with respect to SDR video. The first is stabilization. The stabilization on the new iPhone 13 is very good. In the Pro versions, the wide camera is stabilized twice, both with an optical image stabilizer on the lens and with a sensor shift or in-body image stabilization on the sensor itself. Those two things combined mean that you can get really, really rock steady video in poor shooting conditions. Here's one that I had my wife hold the phone against the dashboard of the car as we drove through a canyon. And you can see that the vibrations are just dampened into nothing. And we're able to keep a very, very consistent, smooth shooting as if we were on a gimbal or as if we had some other form of compensation going on there. And that's all done in camera. Optical image stabilization has been extended to the telephoto lens on the Pro models. That lens has been extended from a 2.5x telephoto to a 3x. And so adding in that image stabilization really gives you crisper images for video or for stills with that stabilization. In third-party apps, you can actually turn this off, and you might want that if you're using an external gimbal or stabilizer, something that's handling all of that for you, or if you want to get the shaky cam look that you'll get with a handheld style. You'll want to turn that stabilization off. A few of the third-party apps I tested give you gradients for how much stabilization you can have and how strong do you want that effect. Let's talk about lens flares. This was my biggest issue with the iPhone 12. In low light conditions, you're constantly getting ghosting and lens flares. It took me a little while to figure out exactly why this was happening and why it didn't disappear between generations. But I realized it's actually a decision that Apple has actively made in order to keep the phone functional for a lot longer. It all comes down to the front lens element, the sapphire glass. Typical lenses are made out of borosilicate glass. The iPhone has those elements. They're just behind a synthetic sapphire front element. And that synthetic sapphire is very, very strong. On the Mohs hardness scale, it's a 9 compared to between 5.5 and 7.5 for the silicon dioxide, the borosilicate glass, and the titanium dioxide that are used as the lens elements and as the anti-reflection coating layers. So what that means is that if you get sand and it grinds against your sapphire lens, that sand is going to be less hard and isn't going to scratch your lens. And I saw that when I looked at my wife's iPhone 11 Pro that she'd had in her pocket for 2 years. The front screen had a few scratches here and there, but the glass lenses that are protruding out beyond the case are immaculate. There's no scratches on them. And so by using that sapphire coating, Apple is able to keep that lens working for the entire life cycle of the phone, for the first user, second user, third user, or whomever uses the phone. The problem is, if you want that as your outer layer, you can't put on the SiO2 or the TiO2 layers that prevent those flares, that give it that anti-reflection property. Otherwise, they're going to scratch up. Because of the choice to use that sapphire, you are going to get those flares. Now, they land at about 8 stops below the light source. In normal shooting conditions, that's actually below where your blacks are. However, in nighttime, you're going to see a lot of that ghosting and a lot of that flaring. And that's all because of that sapphire glass that keeps the glass sharp no matter what you do with it, no matter where it ends up in your pocket with anything other than diamond. Let's talk about HDR video. Now, this section, I'm going to have a lot of examples that are going to come up on screen that are mastered in HDR. And if this is something that's important to you, I would really recommend watching this section in HDR. And of course, if you watch it on the iPhone, you're going to get it in HDR. The first thing we're going to talk about is ProRes video. Now, this is the feature that really told me that I had to upgrade the camera in order to test. However, at launch, ProRes is not on the phone. At this point, the 15.1 developer beta has it, and I have seen it show up in a third-party app. And I did a couple of quick tests to it literally right before I filmed this segment. And I was actually a little disappointed in ProRes because initially, ProRes was requiring you to only shoot in SDR. I couldn't do HDR. I couldn't change the tone curve in Filmic Pro to either Filmic Log or HLG. So I was stuck with SDR. What was weird to me is that comparing that with the Dolby Vision HDR using 10-bit HEVC, I was actually getting cleaner images and sharper out of the Dolby Vision than I was with the ProRes. Now, that again might be a problem with just this initial implementation in the third-party app. However, I have a suspicion it's not. What I was seeing a lot of was noise in the lows, especially with just a little bit of change in exposure to cover my highlights. That noise floor just basically ballooned up, and since ProRes is a lot more lightly compressed and doesn't have that interframe compression that you find in the HEVC, I think you're actually going to be able to see that noise floor. And the noise floor on these cameras is not particularly pretty. It's not a normal Gaussian function. Now, I'm really hoping with this update into 15.1 that we're going to get cleaner ProRes, that the full implementation is going to work a lot better. But that's just my first impressions of it for now. Now, one thing that I have already tested that does work really well with ProRes is transferring ProRes to the phone and to other iOS 15 devices. You can send a ProRes file to the camera and edit it in the iPhoto app. Watch it on your iPad under iOS 15. So there's a number of different models with iOS 15 that are all allowing you to use ProRes. So this is a really, really good advance to be able to use ProRes, at least the files so far on the iPhone, and it looks really, really good in the test that I did. Now, time-lapse mode and slow motion mode, don't work with HDR. Part of that is just the way that the stills are working for time lapse and how it's converting them to video. Part of the slow motion is just it can't process as much information when you're shooting in high speed, so it's discarding a lot more. It's not doing that interpretive work. I think it might be possible on the 13 Pros with their chips and their battery life, but that's a decision that Apple's made that you can't do that. However, you can shoot cinematic mode with HDR. So if you're trying to get your phone to match a camera log format as part of a larger production, or if you're trying to just do cinematic videos in HDR on your phone, you're going to be able to use that feature. And that's really, really cool. You're going to get that HLG, you're going to get that Dolby Vision metadata, and it's going to look really, really good. Let's talk about overall sensor dynamic range. Exactly how much dynamic range do I have access to when I'm shooting with the phone? So what I did is I set up a test using an optical signal generator. This is a 13-step or 12-stop chart. This means that I can basically measure up to 12 stops of dynamic range with a little bit of error on each side to see exactly how is the phone capturing this. One of the problems that I had with capturing this with the default camera app was that the Apple auto exposure was not exposing properly for the chart, but I still was able to get a lot of really useful data out of it as I brought it up to a brighter environment. And what I wanted to share with you was the results of that. What is the dynamic range? Well, in SDR, you're getting about 8 stops of dynamic range on all of the cameras and in most shooting conditions. The noise profile gets elevated as you go into the night modes, but you are able to retain a lot of detail into the blacks. In HDR, you're still only getting about 8 to 9 stops of dynamic range using the default camera app. Now, that is definitely not the sensor dynamic range for the 3 different sensors that I have on the rear cameras. And I know that because I measured them using a third-party app. And on the main wide sensor, I was able to saturate HLG with very little noise. By changing the shutter speed and using ND, I was able to measure the full sensor dynamic range closer to 13. Real world conditions will be a little bit different than that, but it's still pretty good. The other cameras, I wrote this down. The ultra wide has 8 in the default app and about 11 stops at ISO 24 in third-party apps with high bit rates to reduce the amount of loss in the darks. The telephoto lens has around 11 stops in the default app, which was weird that it was higher than the wide in the testing that I did, though that could be an auto exposure error. And I was able to measure it at about 12 stops at ISO 54 with the highest bit rate. One thing to note is that both the telephoto and the ultra-wide get noisier quicker. Their sensors are not quite as large. They're not the main cameras on this phone, and so they don't have quite the same dynamic range as the primary sensor on the phone. So if you're attaching third-party lenses, the wide is the one that you want to use if you're trying to capture and maximize dynamic range. In a lot of situations, you're actually going to want to use ND if you're trying to maximize the dynamic range of the phone. Not a huge amount. You're only looking at needing about 3 stops of ND. In bright shooting conditions, that's going to push down the highlights to a point where Apple is able to better capture them using its curves. You're going to get a more natural look on your images. The same thing's going to be true with the third-party apps. By throwing on the ND, you're protecting your highlights and making it so that you don't have to change your shutter speed or your shutter angle in order to reduce the amount of light coming into the camera so you don't get that stuttery kind of motion. So let's talk about exactly how Apple is doing HDR exposure because it's a little non-intuitive. The sensor has a dynamic range of about 13 stops. HLG has a dynamic range of about 12-ish stops. And when you're under ideal conditions in a third-party app, you're going to be able to saturate HLG at a base ISO of 34 on the wide. However, that's not how Apple's default camera app is actually reading the scene. Apple is instead doing a tone mapping between the scene data recorded by the camera sensor and what it passes on and encodes in HLG. If you're shooting in bright conditions, the ISO, shutter speed, and aperture combination that Apple has as its darkest exposure actually will still create clipping. And if you were to capture that with a proper HLG curve, you would actually have a clip on your sensor. Now, I don't mind that because I'm dealing with professional film and that's ideal for me because I know that the sensor's clipped. I need to adjust my exposure, use some ND. However, for the most casual users, that's not what you want. So instead, what Apple does is as you shift your exposure, it does kind of an S curve where it holds the brightest part of the sensor at the maximum HLG value and the darkest part of the sensor at the darkest HLG value, and then does an S curve that moves up and down as it handles the exposure in HDR to really only capture about 8 stops of dynamic range. This S curve can be really aggressive in bright conditions, and you can have a lot of tearing on bright gradients. Like you can see here on this image of my daughter, there are 2 stops that are being pulled into 5 in the highlights, and then when you put it on the iPhone screen, that extends it out another factor of 2. You basically are stretching out 1 stop into 8 on the phone, and it really, really looks gross. That's a little bit wonky, and it really makes it hard to know exactly what you're capturing in HDR. In fact, I've actually gone and shut off HDR for most of my everyday captures. Now, you can compensate that with a look adjustment, but I'm going to come to why that may not be what you want to do in the default app later. What I have found is that if you shoot with a -1 EV, you actually get a little bit better of a curve, though it's still not ideal to actually mapping the proper tone scene. This isn't an issue with the third-party apps. They're actually going to map into HLG with a lot more accuracy, and you're going to be able to then reverse that and regenerate scene light. So the next thing I wanted to mention was the noise in the darks with HLG. There's a distinct improvement between the noise in the darks on my iPhone 12 Pro versus the iPhone 13 Pro. The noise profile is less flickery overall. It's really aggressive on the 12. If you brought down the exposure later in post, it got better, but it still wasn't great. The iPhone 13 is a lot better. It's still got a little bit of that flicker, but it does look really good overall, probably gaining about an additional stop. I don't know 100% sure if that is just the better sensor that the 13 has, or if it's compression related, or a little bit of both. Now let's talk about the Dolby Vision component of shooting HDR on the iPhone. So Dolby Vision is a set of metadata that is added to the video file that helps displays understand the image. Now, HLG is a great format to shoot in. It's versatile and allows you to, in especially live productions, capture a very good HDR image and an SDR, a workable SDR image from the same shot from the same video file. Now, the problem is that on different display brightnesses and different display contrasts, you're going to get a different look with HLG between every single screen. This is what the Dolby Vision metadata is going to try and fix. If you're using the Dolby Vision metadata, and if you're connecting that video file to a Dolby Vision device that will read that metadata, you're actually able to keep the same look on your high dynamic range iPhone all the way through your middle dynamic range televisions and to your lower dynamic range SDR displays. Now, most Apple devices made in the last few years from 2018 on all support Dolby Vision. And so as I tested on those devices, what I found was the Dolby Vision made the image look the same on all those devices. When I take that HLG essence, though, and throw it into other apps or on other screens that don't support Dolby Vision, that's when you start to see a lot more variance coming from that HLG. So if you're shooting and mastering on your phone, Dolby Vision is going to work really well at preserving the look on your phone. You can actually go and edit the look of the image on your phone using the Photos app, and Dolby Vision is going to preserve that look through delivery. There are some caveats with that, and I'm going to come to those in a minute when we talk about delivering the HDR from the iPhone. But overall, that's what the Dolby Vision component is doing. It's running a live analysis of your image, handling that conversion to SDR and optimization for all of the different screens that you're going to look at. Now, here's one of the problems with with HLG on the iPhone. The iPhone screen is very, very good. In fact, it's one of the higher dynamic range screens that I've seen on the consumer market. The 12 Pro OLED had a really great dynamic range. In my side to sides, I was seeing that the 13 had a slightly higher dynamic range and better movement down to the blacks. Now, I can't confirm that for all models, but that's just what I was seeing in my side by sides using the same images. Now, the problem is with HLG is that it's going to stretch out that HDR image to fill the screen as much as it can in terms of its dynamic range. That means that you can end up with a very, very contrasty image on your iPhone screen. If you're using Dolby Vision and you send that to other HDR screens that are Dolby aware, you're going to get a similar look to what you're seeing on your phone. If you send it to non-Dolby Vision devices, to DaVinci Resolve to do color correction or whatever it is that you're doing, you actually lose a lot of that look and it comes back to the HLG that the camera originally captured in. And that is a better starting point for color grading, but it does mean that you can get some variation between the screens, especially if because of the huge amount of aggressive contrast that I'm seeing, I want to flatten the image a little bit to restore a more natural look. That's great when I'm using Dolby Vision as my distribution method, when I'm sending it to a place that uses Dolby Vision, but it's less great when I'm sending it to places that don't. Let's talk about what those places are. You probably saw the Vimeo announcement that they support Dolby Vision. This is a really, really useful tool because it means that when you upload your Dolby Vision files to Vimeo and when you upload your files from your iPhone that you've shot to Vimeo, what you see on the iPhone is going to be what you're seeing in HDR with Dolby Vision capable displays and in SDR, because Vimeo is going to use that Dolby Vision metadata to generate the best possible SDR. And it's going to look very close to what you see on the phone on a good quality screen, which is super, super, super impressive. Now, on other HDR capable platforms like YouTube, if you try and upload directly from your phone, you actually can't upload the HDR. Instead, it's going to reprocess it back into SDR. If you take the file and push it up on the computer, then YouTube will take that HDR file, but it'll only be the HLG essence that you're working with. So you're going to get a slightly different look. For all other platforms going from the phone that don't support HDR, Apple takes the image that it's created and reverses its color processing on it to regenerate scene light, and then moves it forward through to SDR. And I tested this on Instagram. I did the same shot in SDR and HDR from the same perspective, verified that they look different and that they had different data, but then uploaded them to the same platform back to back. And when I do that, they look very, very close. The highlights are the same, the midtones are the same, everything is the same between the shots. And I'm able to verify that that's how Apple's doing this. So that's really, really useful when sharing to platforms like Instagram. However, it can cause a problem when you adjust the look on your phone. That aggressive S-curve makes me want to soften those highlights a lot. The problem is when I then go take that file and pass it over towards Instagram, when Apple generates that SDR, they don't remove my edit. In fact, they leave it in place and then do the reverse there. So it actually comes out a lot flatter on the SDR version of those. This is where Dolby Vision would help, but there's a lot of challenges in getting Dolby Vision onto a platform like Instagram or like Facebook that hopefully will be fixed in the future. But for now, it's just this kind of nebulous gray area, which means that if you want to take your video that you've shot on the iPhone in Dolby Vision and you want to get it everywhere looking the same, your best workflow is to actually upload it to Vimeo, download the SDR from video, and then use that as your source file for Instagram and Facebook, TikTok, all of these other platforms. If you're taking those files and uploading them on the computer to the platforms, you might see different results. For instance, Facebook wasn't honoring any of the Dolby Vision metadata. It was using the HLG to do the conversion into Rec 709. Same thing with TikTok from the computer. Instagram refused to allow me to upload videos to Instagram from the computer, though I was able to do that when they were in SDR 8-bit. It's just the 10-bit. Instagram was just like, nope, not touching that. And then again, YouTube, I mentioned, it'll just keep the HLG essence. So it's worth looking at that in HLG before you upload it to a platform like YouTube to make sure that it looks the way that you want to. The way that I do this in my home office, by the way, is that I have my Small HD OLED 22 set to Rec 709 and my LG C10 OLED set to HLG, and I grade cross-referencing between the two displays. Now, if you take PQ and convert it into HLG with Dolby Vision, or just use a Rec 2100 conversion and map it into Rec 2100 HLG, it's still going to look good. So this is a very different beast than those kind of delivery methods, but this is something to think about and take a look at if you're a professional wanting to shoot in HDR on the iPhone and trying to figure out how to deliver that, or if you're working with someone who wants to shoot HDR on the iPhone for their own vlog, corporate work, whatever it is that they're doing. This is how you get that look to be preserved from the iPhone into all of your distribution platforms. The last thing I wanted to bring up in this video was talking about shooting with third-party apps on the iPhone. I have tested a lot of different apps to see what they do, and especially to see what they do in HDR. Here's the different apps that I've tested: Filmic Pro, ProCam, Manual, Beastcam, ProTake, ProMovie, Mavis, Movie Pro, and the DJI Go 4 app. All of those, except for one, have some form of HDR. They all have additional tools that are available to you, but I wanted to just tag this on to talk about what it's like to shoot with HDR in these third-party apps. First and foremost, they do a lot better at capturing a proper scene linear or scene log than the Apple Camera app does. When I look at the optical signal generator, what I'm actually seeing in that step chart is the right steps for HLG capture. When you shoot in Dolby Vision HDR in these third-party apps, you can actually take that data, interpret it as HLG scene, and do a cross conversion into any other log format. Whatever log format you want to work in, you can do that conversion and then integrate that with the rest of your footage. That's really, really useful. All of these apps, with the exception of the DJI Go, have some form of higher bitrate mode too, which when coupled with the HEVC compression means you can actually capture very clean images. That's going to give you cleaner blacks. That's going to extend your dynamic range. That's just basically going to give you a much more professional image. What I found different between most of the apps is the user experience. The interfaces are different. ProTake had the depth of field adaptation on the 12 Pro. Filmic Pro has its own log format and allows you to shoot HLG apart from HLG plus Dolby Vision, which is really cool. Some of them have remote, where you can have a remote director viewfinder connected with a different phone or device. A lot of third-party apps allow you to disable the stabilizer. That's going to allow you to use external stabilizers. And that's something that you may or may not want. It's just going to depend on your shooting profile. All of these different features are very, very useful. What I did have noticed is that when you switch into Dolby Vision HDR, which you need to capture HDR on most of them, some features disappear. Histograms disappear, waveform monitors disappear, vector scopes disappear. I'm really hoping that was a limitation of the processing power of the 12. Generating scopes takes some clock cycles, but so does processing Dolby Vision. So I'm really hoping that with the slightly more powerful chip that's in the 13s, we're actually going to be able to see those come back in the third-party apps, though I actually don't know for sure. You get more dynamic range out of third-party apps and have better control over how to do that exposure in those third-party apps. So if you're trying to use the iPhone for production, while using the default camera app is great for documentary, for just whipping out your phone and shooting, if you have time to do some setups using these other apps, you're going to get a better result. You're going to know more exactly how the camera's capturing the scene, exactly how to interpret that data, and how to cross-convert it between different camera platforms. One last note is that along with the different apertures and the different dynamic ranges that you'll find on the different sensors behind the 3 different cameras, you're actually going to get different base ISOs. They seem to vary anywhere between 20 and 50 for the lowest ISO that they'll go. Sometimes more show up. I'm not 100% sure how Apple is reporting that data to the apps, but just be aware of that variance. You're going to have different exposures because of the different apertures on those lenses. And if you're using the third-party lenses in addition to that, you're going to want to always affix those to the main camera because it has the highest ISO and it lets in the most amount of light. So you're not going to double cut light coming into the camera. I hope that at least part of this has helped you understand how the new iPhone 13 is seeing the world, how it's interpreting that data, how it's applying its looks, and how you can take that and optimize it for your own shooting, whether that's photography, normal videography, or even high dynamic range videography. Dolby Vision is going to be your friend if you're moving into the HDR world, and using those new tools from Vimeo to be able to process that into SDR is going to be a very good workflow and give you really good control over both the HDR and the SDR image that you're working in. I think it's really cool that you can use a device like the iPhone as part of your HDR production pipeline. If you want to learn more about producing and working in HDR, from a little bit of the technical to a lot of the creative for how to generate your looks and to think in higher dynamic range, take my course From Scene to Screen, the HDR Image Pipeline. You can find the first 30 minutes for free here on YouTube or the full course at masterhdrvideo.com. That's going to help you get up and running in HDR in a hurry. If you have any questions or comments about shooting on the iPhone 13 or anything other that's photography or HDR related, let me know in the comments below. I'm always happy to engage and to chat with you about how things work. Until next time, I'm Sam Bilodeau, and I'll see you soon.